The thing nobody tells you about falling is that your hands keep working long after the rest of you knows. Mine were already reaching when the braid let go. 47th floor, west face of the Corabell Tower, the wind coming off the estuary in slabs that smelled of diesel and dead barnacle. I had 3 points of contact and a 4th in reserve, the way I always climbed, the way my father never did. The Kevlar ran up through my belay device, clean and blue and certain. Then it wasn't. 2 centimeters. That's the whole story. A braid rated for 9 of me, sheathed and resheathed, inspected on Tuesdays under the shop's sodium tube, with my thumbnail dragging the weave for the soft spots that mean abrasion has gotten inside the fibers where you can't see it. I'd found one in March, retired the rope. This one I'd missed. A 2-centimeter ghost, worn thin against the lip of a parapet I'd rappelled past 400 times, and the fibers had been letting go 1 strand at a time for a week while I trusted my weight to a lie. It parted with a sound like a struck match. No drama in it. A small dry tick by my left ear, and then the wall I'd been reading my whole life stopped being under me and became a thing rushing upward, all its holds turning to blur. The rust streaks and the pigeon lime and the seam where the precast panels never quite met, sliding past, too fast to grab. I counted. I want that on the record. Not because I'm brave, because counting is what the body does when the mind has nothing left to hold. 8 seconds from 47 floors. You can look it up. The math is honest where nothing else is. 1. The window cleaning rig 2 floors down, its cradle swinging empty, close enough that I saw the wing nut someone had stripped. 2. My harness loops, slack now, useless as cut tendon, flapping at my hips. 3. A herring gull peeled off the cornice beside me, unhurried, going where I was going but better at it, and for half a heartbeat we fell together, and it looked at me the way they look at everything, which is to say, like meat that hasn't finished its argument. 4. The cold found the gap at my collar. 5. I reached for the wall. Stupid, animal, beautiful. My right hand opened and crimped at nothing, the fingers finding the exact shape of a hold that wasn't there, the muscle in my forearm firing the way it had fired 10,000 times to take my whole weight on 4 fingertips. The hand believed. That's the part that survives me, if anything does. The hand always believes there's stone. 6. Below, the loading yard came up in detail. A skip full of broken formwork, a man in a yellow vest looking at his phone, the puddle holding a torn rectangle of sky. 7. I thought about my chalk bag, of all things. The little blue scoop of it at my hip, magnesium carbonate gone to paste in the river air, and how I'd meant to dry it on the radiator and hadn't, and now it didn't matter, and the not mattering was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Some men pray in the last second. I checked my grip. Old habit. You fall, you protect the head, you tuck, and you find purchase. And there is no purchase in 8 seconds of open sky, but the body doesn't accept the memo. My spine knew the litany. 3 points of contact. Test before you trust. Never wait what you haven't checked with your own thumbnail under your own light. I had built a religion out of distrust, and it had kept me alive on every wall in this gray city, and it failed me by 2 centimeters in the one place I'd forgotten to look. The puddle came up to meet me with the sky still in it. I had time, real time, the long, elastic kind that 8 seconds becomes when each one is your last, to understand the joke. A man who lived by ropes, killed by a finger's width of nothing. A man who read every surface and missed the one that mattered. Height was the only thing I'd ever loved without suspicion, and it took me the way it takes everyone, patiently, all the way down. The yellow vest looked up. I didn't feel the ground. There's mercy in that, or there's nothing in that, and I've stopped being able to tell which. Then the puddle closed over the sky, and Taras, who never trusted a hold he hadn't tested, stopped. Cold woke me first, a wet that had soaked through to the shoulder blade and sat there like a hand pressing me into the stone. Then the smell, piss and turpentine, river silt, something sweet gone rotten underneath. All of it pooled in a gutter the width of my new hips. I opened eyes that weren't mine. The lids dragged. Crust at the lashes, salt and old sleep. And above me, a wall went up and up past any honest reckoning. Wet concrete bleeding sodium orange where the lamps caught it, vanishing into a dark that might have been cloud or might have been more wall. I knew height. This wasn't height. This was depth wearing height's clothes. I tried to sit, and the body answered late, the way a frayed rope answers. A half second of stretch before the load comes on. My arms came up thin, wrists like dowel rods, the skin loose over them, a tremor in the tendons I hadn't ordered. I held my own hand in front of my face, and it was a stranger's, knuckles swollen to knots, 2 nails gone black, a tattoo of grime worked so deep into the creases it had stopped being dirt and become the map of the hand itself. Not my hand, not my hunger. The hunger was the loudest thing in the body, a wire run from the throat to the groin, pulled taut and humming. It had a shape. It had been here long before me, and it knew this gutter the way I knew the west face of Corabel, every cold inch of it, every place the runoff gathered. The body remembered being Kel even while I tried to remember being Taurus. I got both names at once and neither fit. I pushed up to 3 points of contact. Old habit even now. Standing took negotiating. The knees ground, the head swam. A black tide came in from the edges and went out again, and when it cleared, I was upright with one palm flat to the wall, and the wall was cold enough to ache through the calluses Kel had worn there. I looked for the top. There wasn't one. The street was a slot. 2 faces of tenement leaning toward each other across maybe 4 meters of wet flag. Balconies stacked 30 high and bridging the gap with washing lines and water pipes and plank walkways someone had bolted on without a permit and without much faith. Light came down in coins. Most of it died before it reached me. A climber's eye works whether you want it to or not. Mine read the slot. Drain pipe, cast iron, bracket every 2 meters. Good for a foot, but the lower brackets stripped to rust lace. Fail at the 3rd. Window ledge a body length up, slick with algae, no good, wet. The seam where 2 buildings almost met, a chimney crack you could jam a forearm into and walk your way to the 2nd balcony. I had the route before I had a reason. Then the reason arrived, and the reason was a man with a long pole. He came along the upper walkway, unhurried, and where the pole touched the wall, the concrete lit. A line of pigment ran out from the tip and crawled and set, blue-white, and a sagging cantilever I hadn't trusted stopped sagging, took its own weight, took his, held. The walkway that had been a suggestion became a road. He never looked down at the gutter. People in the slot stepped back into doorways as his light passed, the way you step back from a current you can't fight. The wall fed him. The wall starved me. I understood the law of the place in my gut before anyone said a word of it. The way you understand a pitch is unclimbable, not by measuring, but by the cold that opens behind your sternum. Up was permission, and permission was painted, and the paint belonged to men with poles. Everything that held weight had been marked by someone licensed to mark it. The unmarked rotted. So did the unmarked people, the ones in the gutters, the wallless, the choked, mouths open at the bottom of the slot like barnacles waiting for a tide that climbed away from them every day. I had loved height without suspicion. Height had answered by burying me at the foot of the tallest thing I'd ever seen, in a body that couldn't climb a flight of stairs without graying out. A herring gull cried somewhere above the coins of light. Same bird, different fall. I bent, slow, joints protesting, and picked through the gutter silt until my fingers closed on something hard and round. A spray can, dented, the nozzle clogged to a bead. Kel's hand knew its weight before mine did. I shook it once and heard, under the rust and the river, a thin, live hiss that had no business being there. 6 hours of held weight, a voice in the body said, in a measure that wasn't mine. I didn't know yet how it knew. The boot took the man 2 doors down before I heard the patrol at all. He'd had a mark on his lintel, a hand-drawn thing, charcoal and hope, the kind of glyph a man scratches when he can't pay for a real one, and the cantilever over his children's bed has started to talk in the night. 3 of them came down the walkway, gray coats, poles racked across their backs like rifles, and a fourth who carried only a ledger and a little iron scraper. They didn't shout. That was the worst of it. No shouting, just the scraper going to work on the charcoal, peeling the false glyph off the stone in curls, and the man on his knees with his forehead to the wet flag, talking fast, and one of the graycoats watching him talk with the patience of someone waiting for a kettle. Then they took him by the elbows. He didn't come back up the slot. He didn't go down it either. He simply went, the way a held breath goes, and the doorway he'd knelt in stood open and ordinary, and the charcoal was gone, and the cantilever above the children's bed had no mark on it at all now, licensed or otherwise. Only the guild paints what lasts. I learned it without a lesson. The unmarked rot. The unmarked vanish. I was already moving by the time the ledgerman's eyes swept the gutter, because a body that has slept in this slot for years knows when to be elsewhere, and Kell's legs carried me into a side cut between two buildings before Terrace had finished deciding to run. Bad cut. I read it as I fled and hated what I read. 4 meters in, the walls necked down to a brick arch, old, soft-jointed, the mortar gone to sugar where the runoff had chewed it for 40 years. No glyph on it. Nothing held it but habit. Behind me, a pole rang on iron. I got under the arch as it let go. I felt it before I saw it. A cough of dust, a shift in the air pressure against my eardrums, the particular silence a structure makes in the half-second after it decides to stop being a structure. The keystone dropped a finger's width. The whole span groaned, a low animal note, and brick dust sifted down through the coin of light and turned it to a column of falling gold. 8 seconds. I knew the number. Kell had counted it once already, falling. The can was in my hand. I don't remember pulling it. Kell's fingers knew its weight the way my fingers had known a carabiner's gait, and the body shook it once and brought it up, and I sprayed. Not aimed, not licensed, not anything but a dying man throwing his arm across his own face. A wild line of cheap pigment across the underside of that failing arch. The nozzle spat its clog and caught. The line went on wet and stupid, a child's scribble, and then it moved. It crawled along the joint the mortar had abandoned, found the crack the keystone had opened, and ran into it like water finding level. Except water falls, and this climbed, against the pool of everything, threading the seam, branching, setting. Blue, white, the color of the licensed men's work, the color that belonged to poles and ledgers and the boot. The arch stopped, not slowed, stopped. The keystone hung at its finger's width of drop and held there as if a hand had closed under it, the groan cut off mid-note, the dust hanging in the gold light and then beginning, gently, to settle. I stood under 3 tons of bad brick that should have been on top of me and felt it take its own weight off my shoulders, weight I hadn't known I was bracing for. The wall was warm where I'd sprayed it. Faintly, under the rust and the river stink, the pigment breathed out a smell like hot pennies and cut grass. I put my thumbnail to the set line. Test before you trust. It was hard as fired enamel, hard as anything the pole men laid down, and it had come out of a dented can I'd dug from a gutter, out of a hand that had never held a license, out of a man the guild would have scraped off the stone and walked away from. That was the thing the graycoats killed for, the thing only they were allowed to do. I stood under the arch I'd hung in the air and understood. With the cold opening behind my sternum, that means a pitch has just changed its whole grade, that the one law holding this entire vertical city together, only the guild may make a thing last, had just broken in my borrowed hands, quietly, with nobody watching but a herring gull and me. And the body, that voice that wasn't mine, was already counting down from 6 hours. The second time I sprayed, nothing was falling, and that was the whole point of it. I found a dead corner 3 slots over, a place the runoff had abandoned, where a length of dropped lintel lay across 2 oil drums like a bench nobody had earned. Test piece. I crouched over it the way I'd crouch over an anchor I didn't trust. Slow on purpose, because a man in a hurry reads a wall wrong, and a wall read wrong is how you end up a rectangle of closing sky. I gave it a dab. Just a dab. A thumbnail of pigment, no more, laid across the lintel's hairline crack. It crawled. Same as before, the wet line waking, threading the fault, branching where the stone wanted to part, and ignoring where it didn't, knowing the load before I did. It set blue-white, the cut grass smell coming up faint, and when I leaned my weight on the lintel, the dab held maybe 40 kilos before the glyph gave a small, dry tick, and a hairline opened beside it. Underdosed. I wrote the number in my head the way I used to log a rope's wear date. More pigment, more hold. I doubled the line, and the lintel took me standing on it, both feet bouncing, the body's bird bones jarring up through Kel's bad ankles. The glyph breathed. That was the thing the polemen's faces never showed, because they laid their lines and walked off proud. Under load, the set line moved. A swell and ease you could feel with a palm flat against it, the way a good rope stretches to eat a fall instead of going dry and parting. My father's rope never gave. He climbed without a point in reserve, and the world let him, until it didn't. So, the pigment was the rope. Dosage was diameter. Thicker line, fatter rune, more tons held. And there had to be a curve to it, a working load against a breaking load. Except nobody in this whole praying city had drawn that curve, because nobody had thought to ask the magic a rude question. They worshipped it. I measured it. I scratched a grid into the silt with a nail and ran the rest of the can across it. A hairline here, a flood there, a dot, a stripe, an X over a brick I cracked on purpose with a chunk of curb. Each one I loaded till it ticked. Each tick I clocked against my own pulse. The pattern came up clean as a fall factor table. Anchor it at 2 points and it shared the weight. Anchor it at 1 and it begged. Lay it across the grain of a crack and it bridged. Lay it along the grain and it only filled. Real structure. Not a blessing, a truss. The drum bench held my whole borrowed weight on a line no wider than a bootlace. Every one of them carried the same quiet clock underneath, the 6 hours ticking down in a body that wasn't mine, the count starting the instant the line went hard. So the strongest beam I could hang in the air would still let go on schedule, clean, no rubble, no stain, no proof I'd broken the one law at all. Temporary. The word should have cooled me. It didn't. 6 hours is a long time on a wall. 6 hours is enough to climb something, or hold something, or get a man out from under 3 tons of bad brick and be gone before the graycoats smell the hot pennies on the air. I sat back on my heels in the runoff, the cold coming through Kel's worn trousers, and I looked at the grid I'd scratched, and the little drying glyphs ticking their lives away in the dark, and something in the body's chest pulled tight that wasn't fear and wasn't hope. The poleman had a license and no curiosity. I had a dented can, a dead man's hands, and 32 years of not trusting anything I hadn't tested twice. I capped the can and shook it once, the ball bearing knocking against the wet sob of paint still left inside. Then I lifted my eyes off the grid and read the slot the way I'd read the west face of Corabel. Not as walls, but as holds and weights, the places it wanted to fail, and the places I could make it lie. The city went vertical. What does a held thing leave behind when its time runs dry? I stayed in the dead corner to find out. Back to the wet brick, knees up, I watched the doubled line on the drum bench, the strongest one, the bootlace room that had taken my whole bouncing weight, and let it ride out its hours while the light slid off the wall in coins and went the color of old tin. The body kept the count for me. Somewhere under Kel's sternum, a clock ran that I hadn't wound, ticking off the seconds clean and indifferent, and I'd already learned not to argue with it. Near the end, the line didn't groan, no sag, none of the slow theater a reel beam gives you before it lets go, the creak, the dust sift, the second chance. It thinned. The blue-white went to gray, the gray went to the idea of itself, and then the lintel was only a lintel laid across 2 oil drums, the hairline crack exactly as wide as it had been, the cut grass smell lifting off the stone like it had never crawled there. No rubble, No scorch, no ash, no powder for a scraper blade to scrape. The glyph hadn't broken under me. It had been recalled. The way a word leaves your mouth half said and won't come back. I laid my palm flat where it had stood. Cold brick, damp, ordinary as a doorstep. A Pullman could crouch in this corner 1 minute after and swear on his license that nothing had ever borne weight here. That was the gift. That was the whole terrible gift of it. I could hang 3 tons of dead brick in the air over a praying city and leave less mark than a herring gull's shadow crossing the runoff. Then I tested the thing that scared me worse than failing. I scratched 2 anchor points a body length apart, set the first line, waited, and when the first had maybe a minute of life left in it, I bridged back across and laid a third over the gap, fresh, its own 6 hours starting cold under my thumb. The first vanished on schedule, no goodbye. The third caught the load. The bench stayed up, not because any single rune endured, but because I kept feeding new ones in ahead of the dying ones, a man crossing a flooded ford on stones he has to fling down in front of his own boots, one at a time, forever. Move or fall. That was the law sitting under the guild's law, quiet as mortar. I sat with it until the cold came up through Kel's trousers. The same trick that made me a ghost made me a galley dog. The clean dissolve that left no evidence left me no rest, because the structure I raised would only stand while I stood moving between my marks, relaying, refreshing, never trusting one hold long enough to breathe on it. Strength and weakness turned out to be one object seen from 2 sides. Like a piton, it stops your fall, then bites so deep into the rock it won't come back out for the next man up. My father climbed without keeping a point in reserve and called it nerve. Here, at last, was my reserve. One that drained whether I spent it or not. I almost laughed, and the laugh came out as breath. 32 years measuring rope wear, logging dates, distrusting every anchor I hadn't tested twice. And the one power that fell into a dead man's hands was the only thing I'd never be allowed to stop watching. 8 seconds had taught me what an unwatched edge costs. 6 hours was just the same lesson stretched long enough to hope inside it. I was still turning the piton over behind my eyes when the slot changed its sound. Iron on stone. A measured tap, then another. The ferrule of a license pole feeling its way down the wet throat of the alley. Unhurried, the gait of men who have never once had to run. 2 sets of boots behind it. The cut grass smell I thought was gone wasn't gone at all. It was rolling back up the corner toward me, fresh off the last line I'd set, and I understood, with the flat clarity of a handhold snapping under load, that I'd laid 1 mark too many, and the wind had already carried it where I couldn't follow. Down, now! A girl's voice, pitched under the drip, no louder than the rust flaking off the drain pipe she crouched behind. I went down. Kel's knees folded before I decided to trust her, the body quicker than the man riding it, and she had my collar in a grip that knew exactly how much weight a fistful of jacket could take. We moved sideways into a seam between 2 tenements I hadn't read as a gap at all, a finger of dark. She fed us through it the way you feed rope through a belay, no slack, no jerk, and behind us the ferrule went tap, tap, patient as a man counting his own coins. The cut grass smell stayed in the dead corner. The patrol followed the smell, not us. She let me breathe only when the slot had bent twice and the light gave out entirely. Up close, she was maybe 14, cheekbones like tent poles, one eye gone milky and the good one doing the work of 3, a lookout's eye. She'd been reading the alley mouths while the rest of the city read its glyphs. You set a mark and sat next to it, she said, flat. Not a question. Curious ones do that. Curious ones go quiet first. I had no answer the shape of hers, so I gave none. She took me lower. The slot opened. Not into light, never into light here, but into a wider dark under a span of dead viaduct where the city had decided a roof was a thing certain people weren't allowed to have. No glyphs braced these walls. The brick wept and bellied and held by the dumb luck of friction. and beneath it, in the wet, lay the people who'd been scraped off Wellgrad's ledgers. The wallless, the choked. Men and women curled on flattened crates, with their breath fogging up toward a ceiling that owed them nothing, and a smell of old smoke and wet wool and bodies kept too long in one place. An old man sat against the soundest pier, hands open on his knees. Mason's hands. I knew them before he spoke. The thumb pads polished flat, a nail blacked and grown back wrong, lime burned so deep into the creases that no water would ever lift it. He watched me the way I'd watched the lintel thin out. "You're the one," he said. "The corner that smelled of cut grass an hour, then smelled of nothing." His voice came up from somewhere chesty and ruined. "I built 40 years under the guild's pigment. I know what a recall costs a wall." Yours left no scar. Dole raised half the cisterns in the low quarter, the girl said, before they took his license for nothing and his roof for the same. He turned his ruined hands over. Empty. "A glyph that vanishes," he said slowly, tasting each word like grit. "Leaves the guild nothing to scrape, nothing to disappear a man over." His good eye found mine and held. "You could hang a roof over us at dusk and let it fall to nothing by dawn, and they'd come at noon and find honest, open air. No structure, no crime. 6 hours. I felt the number turn in me, ugly and bright. I'd measured it as a leash. He'd measured it as a window. "It won't hold itself," I said. "The flat truth. Has to be fed. New marks ahead of the dying ones, all night, every night. Stop moving, and it's gone with everyone under it." The girl didn't flinch. "Then we learn to move," she said. "I watch, he builds. You teach the marks. There's 20 of us could learn to feed a line if it meant a dry head come winter." 20 faces, and I'd been counting them already. Load points, anchor spacing, who could climb, who'd drop. The old climbing arithmetic, run on living weight. I hadn't meant to. A dead man falls and learns to stop watching for the next man up. It had taken a one-eyed lookout and a broken mason to make me start again, and I felt the start of it land in Kel's chest like a piton biting rock. Dole read my silence the way I read mortar. He smiled, and it cost him teeth he didn't have. "Tomorrow," he said. "Before tomorrow, you should know. The polemen aren't the worst of it. The guild keeps something it doesn't license. It comes for marks like yours." 3 days I'd been laying test marks where the undercroft narrowed to a throat, and on the 4th, a smell came down the slot that wasn't ours. Clean, chemical, a whiff of camphor, and something colder under it, like a nail held too long in the mouth. I was mid-spray when I caught it. The can hissed in my fist, the line crawling up the green joint between 2 courses of brick I'd meant to bridge before dawn. Half set, blue-white going to bone, and my thumb came off the nozzle the way a hand comes off a hold that started to flex. I went still. The body went stiller. Kel's lungs locked before the man writing them gave the order, and I pressed flat into the cold seam and counted. Because counting is the only prayer I've ever kept. Boots, soft soles, not iron. Footsteps then, not the feral tap of a poleman, not the patient coin counting of a patrol, but soles laid down with the deliberation of someone who trusted his nose over his eyes, and a long shadow folded into the slot's mouth and stopped where the alley kinked. He had a lamp he didn't light. He carried a brass instrument on a strap, a thing with a fluted mouth, and he raised it to the wall and breathed the brick through it the way a doctor listens to a chest. I watched his throat work. He sniffed the corner where I'd set my first mark 4 hours back. The one already gone, recalled clean, dissolved to nothing while I worked the next. There should have been a scar. A normal recall leaves a scar. 40 years had told Dole that much. A pale, leached ghost in the mortar where the guild's pigment had been peeled away. Mine left nothing. The instrument found nothing. He held it there a long moment, fluted mouth an inch off the joint, and I watched the doubt crawl into his shoulders, the small downward tug a man gets when his tools tell him he's wrong and his gut won't fold. He tapped the brick. He sniffed his own glove. Then he straightened, and his face caught a wedge of sodium light, young, scrubbed, eyes pouched from reading walls in the dark, a gilt seal inked blue at the wrist where a vein should be. Not a monster. Worse, a clerk with a nose. He came 3 steps closer. My half-set mark glowed up the joint above his head, soft as foxfire, 4 hours from full, and bright as a confession to anyone who'd think to look up. He didn't look up. The Wallace had taught me that already. Men who read walls forget the sky, and the city had trained him to hunt at chest height, where honest crime lived. I breathed through my teeth. The pigment ticked, underdosed, a faint, clean tick like a cooling stove, and I let the camphor in his own gear eat the cut grass off the air. It did. He turned. He went back up the slot the way he'd come, souls whispering, instruments swinging, and behind my ribs, Kel's heart kicked like a dropped tool ringing off scaffold 3 floors down. I didn't move until the camphor thinned, and the drip took the alley back. The mark above me ticked on. Then it paled, branched thinner, and let go. Recalled to cold brick, no rubble, no ghost. The joint left exactly as the guild had laid it, gone before it could damn me. There was the lesson, laid bare in the wet. The thing I'd cursed as a leash had just bought my neck back. 6 hours wasn't a cage. 6 hours was the alibi. A roof that ate itself left a man honest by sunrise, and there was no instrument in that brass kit that could smell a wall which had never, on paper, been touched. I climbed down to the undercroft with the spent can warm in my fist. Dole was awake, hands open on his knees, reading me before I crossed the light. The girl crouched at the pier, milky-eyed to the dark, the good one on my face. He came, I said, sniffed the seam, found honest air. The old man didn't smile this time. He waited. I set the empty can down between us, hard, a stake driven into floor. We build, I said. Tomorrow at dusk. Every dusk after, we move. Dole wanted to know what a cracked can could do that 40 years of his lime never had. I didn't say it. I built it. He'd chosen the ground already, the dead wedge under the 3rd pier, where the viaduct's haunch met a slumped course of brick, and the rain came straight down the gap like water down a flue. 5 of the Wallace slept along its dry lip and woke soaked regardless. The oldest, a woman with a dock hook where a hand should be, coughed in the dark like gravel turning in a tin. I crouched and read the wedge the way I'd once read a wall to climb it. 2 piers, 1 fallen lintel slumped but whole, the grain of its crack running crosswise to the span. Good bones, bad luck only. I shook the first can. The bead knocked. I laid a line off the live pier and across the lintel's crack, across the grain where a glyph bridges instead of merely filling, and thumbed the dose thick, diameter to load, because this would carry more than its own weight before the night ran out. The pigment crawled the joint. It branched, set blue-white, went to bone. 2 anchors took it between them, and neither begged. Then I stacked the loose brick back into the gap, course on course, and stitched each one to the next with a thread no wider than a bootlace. Dose dropped low where the load was only itself. An hour, maybe less. When I straightened, my spine cracked like wet rope, and the wedge had a roof. A low, blue-veined ceiling of someone else's broken brick, holding hard a finger's width over the dock hook woman's head, the seams glowing soft as foxfire, and already counting themselves down toward dawn. Dry stone under it. The drip walked the edge now and fell outside, where the rain belonged. Dole put his flat thumb to a joint and didn't press. He knew better than to test another man's set. His face moved the way old mortar moves, slow, grudging, cracked. A cistern took me 2 seasons, he said, tasting each word like grit through the gap in his teeth. A year's wage in sealed guild pots. They meter the pigment. They tax the line. A poor parish waits a generation for a roof it'll never afford. He looked up at the blue. You did it with 3 dented cans and the daylight you had left. Cheap pigment, I said. Honest geometry. He laughed, or coughed. Hard to tell with that chest. Word ran the undercroft before the light died. They came quiet, the wallless, the way cats come near, not toward you, only nearer, testing the air. A man with a burned face, 2 children sharing one coat between them, a boy who'd lost a leg to a tram and got around on a crutch carved from a balustrade. They stood at the edge of the dry and looked at the dry like it was bread. The dock hook woman reached up and laid her good hand flat against the underside of my roof, feeling the warmth still leaking out of the set, and she didn't say thank you. She said, "Mine next." That was the trade opening its eyes. She had nothing the guild counted as wealth. None of them did. What she had was a fistful of copper wire stripped off a dead lamp, and the burned man had a working knife, and the boy on the carved crutch knew every unwatched seam in the low quarter the way I'd once known knots. Shelter for wire, dry stone for a blade, a roof for the map of a city's blind spots. The one thing the guild had made a hanging crime, sold out of a viaduct's gut by a man whose name no register would recognize, to people the city had already crossed off its books. Nothing rank, all of us. Below counting. I took the wire. I took the knife. I told the boy I'd want his map by tomorrow's dusk, and he grinned with the half of his teeth he had left. Behind me, the roof ticked, paling, eating itself honest toward morning. I shook the second can. We were open for business. Morning took the roof the way frost leaves a pane. No crack, no fall, the blue-white thinning to gray to the idea of itself, then only cold brick where a ceiling had been. The dock hook woman woke dry under nothing. No scar, no powder. The wedge stood as the rain had left it, the crack still the width it had always been, the defect unhealed and indifferent, and that was the bargain underneath all of it. I held the weight, never the wall. I timed it from the dark across the way, counting in my teeth. 6 hours, less the drag of a half-fed pulse. You learn the clock, or the clock learns you. By the third night they'd learned it. That was the part I hadn't planned for. The people. Stone I could read. A lintel tells the truth the moment you lay a thumb to its grain. People lie with their whole bodies and believe themselves while they do it. The wallless came back each dusk regardless, and stayed, and something in the staying knotted itself into a crew without my asking. I made the rule simple, the way you make a knot simple so a cold hand can still tie it. Raise at dusk, sleep under the blue, pack before it pales, roll your coat, your wire, your tin, and wear it on your back when the seams go gray, because a roof that recalls itself owes you no warning, and a man caught reaching under a dissolving line gets nothing dropped on him and everything taken away. Move before the mark moves. The drum I beat with the flat of an empty can, pack before it pales. The dock hook woman caught it first. 40 years of tides had taught her a clock you couldn't argue with. She had them up and rolled while the ceiling still glowed, squinting at the seams like a fishwife reading weather off a flat sky, and she was never wrong by more than a minute of my own count. Then the boy with the carved crutch, who brought his map and 3 more behind it. The burned man, who honed his knife on my dry stone and missed nothing. 24 by week's end, drifting in from seams I hadn't known were unread. Anver came on the 5th dusk, young. Too young for the patience he mined. He had a cough coming on early and hands that wouldn't settle, and he stood too close while I worked, close enough that I smelled the wet ash in his coat and felt his breath ride my shoulder while the pigment crawled. "How do you know," he said, "when to stop the line?" "When the load's met." "How do you know it's met?" I shook the can instead of answering. The bead knocked. I laid the bridge across the grain, thumbed the dose to the crack's exact width, and he watched it set blue-white and go to bone. And I saw him try to swallow the whole of it at once, the way I'd swallowed the wall under the brick arch. Too fast, too hungry, no floor under the wanting. "You don't learn it watching me," I said. "You learn it from a wall that nearly kills you. Then you don't forget." He nodded like I'd handed him scripture. Wrong thing to hand anyone. I'd spent a whole life trusting rope because rope can't pray, can't flatter, can't decide to like you and quit on you the same hour. And here was a boy looking at me the way the parishes looked at the guild, and the look lay on my shoulders like a soaked coat. I gave him the timer instead. A job, not a faith. "You count," I told him. Out loud, against your own pulse, from the moment the last seam sets, you call the pack. Wrong by a minute, you're wrong early, never late. Understand? His chin came up. What if I miscount? Then someone sleeps in the rain and remembers whose mouth they trusted. I let it find the floor. So don't. He didn't. He stood at the wedge's lip every night after, lips moving, one finger pressed to the soft of his throat, calling the fall of the light like a man working a halyard down a gale. A clock no guild instrument could read, kept in the pulse of a coughing boy. 3 nights of clean dissolves. Then the lookout girl came low and fast through the unread seam, her one eye blown wide, and said the word that empties a wall. Hunters! The hunter's brass clicked twice over the cold wedge and came up empty. No scar on the mortar, no powder caught on his glass, the crack still exactly the width the rain had left it, nothing for his needle to swing toward. He never looked up. They went north along the wall with their lanterns rocking, a slow chain of light reading the wrong floor, and the girl counted them gone the way she counted everything, in flinches. We didn't lie in that seam again. 2 viaducts down we found the light well, a dry brick shaft punched up through 4 dead floors by some landlord's old notion of air, open at the crown to a coin of sky the color of a healing bruise. Anver tipped his head back into it. So did I. I'd spent a whole first life going up, Corabel's flank under my boots, the braid singing thin, 8 seconds of the river rising to meet me. Now I had a starved body that owed the dark 6 hours and a shaft that wanted filling. And something in me that had been pressed flat against close walls for weeks stood up and looked at the height and refused for one night to stay low. So I built one. We made it out of the shaft's own ruin. The crew threw a chain, the burned man at the foot splitting brick clean with the heel of his knife, the dock hook woman swinging each one up on the spur of her hook, hand to hand to hand, and I set them. A course, a load line laid across the grain so it bridged, 2 anchors to share the weight, never one to beg. Another course, and I thumbed the dose to a thread where the lean ran light and laid it thick where it wanted to walk, and the slim thing climbed the well like a spine finding itself, blue-white seams cooling to bone. Dole pressed his flat thumb to the 3rd course and held it there, tasting the stone with 40 years of lime burned into his creases. No scar, he said, chesty, ruined. I never once set a block that didn't cost the next one. This costs nothing. He didn't smile. His eyes did the work a smile would, move or fall. I went up the inside of my own tower, refreshing the low lines before their hours thinned them out from under us. A fresh bridge laid cold across each tiring one, the load stepping over to the new mark while the old went gray and was recalled behind me. Quiet. No drop, no rubble, just brick going ordinary in my wake as I climbed past it. They came up after me, Anver first, lips moving, one finger at the soft of his throat. The boy with the carved crutch hauled on the dock hook woman's rope. The lookout girl, one eye blown wide, came up like she'd been born on a line. A dozen of us packed the crown of the shaft, breathing the same cold, and over the lip the city lay flattened and wet, sodium pooling in the lanes, the guild's grand wall standing, for the first time in any life we owned, lower than our feet. A herring gull cut the coin of sky and screamed at nothing. Nobody spoke for the length of it. I felt the clock in my teeth, the lines below already tiring, the whole defiant spine of the thing living on minutes I'd either spend or surrender. The dock hook woman read the seams the way she read a flat sky. "Pale soon," she said, not a question. I could have run the relay till dawn, fed the tower my pulse, bridge by bridge, kept moving until the hunters came back or my heart quit first. I looked at the gull. I looked at them, all of them up here in the wind they were never meant to be allowed. Then I stopped climbing. We came down ahead of the gray, and I let the last lines go unrefreshed. The tower thinned under us as we left it, blue-white to gray to the idea of itself, and the brick it had carried came down soft into waiting hands, course by cold course. A thing taken apart, not a thing that fell, no scar in the shaft. No proof we'd ever stood that high. Anver walked off with one brick buttoned inside his coat, carried flat against his ribs like a relic. I let him keep it. The brass kept finding nothing, and that nothing was the problem. I should have felt it sooner. Each roof I raised and let thin came down the same way. Cold brick lowered into waiting hands, no powder on the glass, no scorch on the stone. The crack underneath still the width the rain had left it. And each time the guild's needle swung over the floor, it caught a flat, dead arc that pointed at no one. A clean read. Every settlement the same. We got greedy with mercy. The dockhook woman brought me a tannery cellar where 40 slept on wet ash, and I bridged its sagging spine before the lamps guttered. The next night, a half-sunk chandlery. The night after, a coalie where the wind had been eating children since winter. Word about a dry floor moves faster than any patrol. I'd turn into a lane I'd never walked and find a can already drumming on its rim, a timer boy already mouthing his count, a floor swept down to the joists and waiting for my lines. 11 roofs in 9 nights. I moved between them the way I moved inside the towers. Refresh, step over, let the spent line go gray behind me, the load walking onto the cold mark while the old one thinned to the idea of itself. Move or fall. The work was clean. That was the trap, and I climbed into it grinning. I never saw the vessel. I saw his method laid over Wellgrad like a grid of pins. Where the residue men read scorch and powder and went home empty, he read the lack of it. The floors too clean, the cellars where lungs had fogged the cold all night and left no soot, no straw, no name scratched into the lime. He didn't hunt the glyph. He hunted the hole it punched in the ordinary, the way a tongue hunts the gap a pulled tooth leaves. They came down on the gasworks shanty at first gray. Plumb line enforcers, 6 of them, oiled coats gone black with the wet, iron bobs slung at their hips like little stopped hearts. They fast-roped off the gas holder's rim and dropped into the courtyard sure as herring gulls onto a wreck. The fire still breathed warm. The straw still held the dent of a sleeping shoulder. No shoulder. No roof either. It had thinned an hour before dawn, lowered itself course by cold course into hands already 3 lanes gone, the brick restacked along the wall like it had never once been asked to fly. The lead man crouched. He pressed 2 bare fingers to the ash and turned his palm up, slow, reading the heat that hadn't had time to leave the grate. A whole town's warmth banked in 1 yard. Not one wall to charge a soul with. It should have read like a loss to him. For a breath it did. Then he stood, and he didn't curse the emptied air the way the brass man cursed my honest floors. He looked at it the way I look at a flank before I climb, weighing what wasn't there. I got the rest third hand, off the lookout girl, who had it off a boy who blacked the enforcer's boots in the guild yard. The lead man unfolded a chart already freckled with marks. Every clean room, every floor that should have caved and hadn't. Every warmth without a wall, going back 9 nights, each pin pushed through the paper where a town had stood and then unstood itself before the light could name it. He set 1 more pin in the gasworks, stepped back, tilted his head the way Anver tilts his into a light well. The pins made a shape. Not a map of damage, there was none, but the print of the thing that left no damage. The negative of a man stitched across the city in holes, a reaching silhouette drawn entirely in what had gone missing. 40 years of masons swore a recall always costs a wall. Here was a hand that took no payment, and the guild had found the one way left to weigh it, by the exact size of the absence it kept leaving behind. The bootboy said the vessel folded the chart along its old creases, smoothed it flat with 1 thumb, and spoke once, quiet, to the whole still room. He has a shape now. The thing about a man who hunts absence is that you can't watch him work without becoming the thing he's drawing. I learned his name slow, in pieces, the way you learn a wall's bad face. Not all at once, never the whole of it, just the holds that fail under weight. Vessel. Not a name his mother gave, a title the guild poured him into when they found a mason who could stand in an emptied room and feel the shape of what had stood there. The way I can stand at the foot of a flank and feel in the soles of my feet where the rock will spit me. He didn't read scorch. He read the cold. The boot boy kept talking, for a price, and the lookout girl kept carrying it. Through them, I built him. He worked a chart the way other men worked a confession. Each pin he'd set was a question, and the empty floors answered him, not with damage, there was none, but with the grammar of how I moved. Refresh, step over, let it gray, the spent line walking its load onto the cold mark while I climbed 3 lanes ahead. He'd seen it enough times now to feel the rhythm in it. A man's gait leaves a stride length, so does a man's mercy. He measured mine. The girl said he'd stand in a cleared cellar past the point of use after his enforcers had given up and gone to warm their hands, and he'd put his bare palm flat to the lime where a roof had lowered itself an hour before, reading the heat that hadn't fled yet, the banked warmth of 40 lungs, the faint grease a sleeping crowd leaves on stone. From that, he'd take a direction, not where I'd been, where the dry floor would call me next. He started arriving early. Twice that week, I turned into a lane already drumming, a timer boy already mouthing his count, and felt the wrongness before I saw it. A plumb-line bob, iron, slung at a hip in a doorway that should have held only the wallless, the oiled coat gone black with the wet and patient as a stain. Both times I walked past, empty hands, slack face, a body that had learned in 100 towers to look like it weighed nothing. The brass would have found nothing on me. He wasn't carrying brass. He was carrying the chart, folded along its old creases, and a way of tilting his head into the dark that I knew, because Anver does it into a light well. A residue hunter who chases powder will always be a day behind a man who leaves none. Vessel had thrown the powder away. He'd understood the one thing the brass men never would, that I don't repair, that I hold the weight and never the wall, that every morning my work undoes itself and hands the crack back exactly as the rain left it, unhealed, indifferent, no scar to swab. He stopped looking for the crime. He started looking for the kindness, because kindness keeps a schedule, and a schedule can be walked toward in the dark. Dogma gave him his patience. The guild talked that a recall always costs a wall. 40 years of masons swore it, swore the brick must fall, swore the ledger always balances in rubble. And here was a man whose ledger balanced in restacked courses and dry ash, and instead of breaking against that, Vessel folded it into his faith. The world was orderly. If it didn't read like sin, then sin had found a new face, and a new face could be learned. He'd learn mine the way I learn a flank, one hold at a time, as long as it took. I should have packed the crew that night and gone north, the way the brass men went north. I didn't. I told myself the gasworks was a fluke, that a man can't pin warmth he hasn't measured, that 6 hours is the alibi, and the alibi had never once failed. I told myself the floors would keep me ahead, but under the viaduct's 3rd pier, where my first dead wedge still held its finger of dry air over sleeping heads, the lookout girl pressed something into my hand, a chart pin, iron, still warm from a guild palm, found stuck in the lime and arm's reach from where I'd slept. He'd already been here. He'd left it for me to find. The can went cold in my fist before the line was half laid, and I shook it wrong. 3 strokes where it wanted 6, the bearing pigment thin as skimmed milk along a lintel that needed it thick. And I knew before the spray had set. Too late to pull it. I'd come in fast. The chart pin rode in my coat seam like a splinter you feel with every breath. Warm an hour ago, cold now. The cold of it gone up into my hands. A man who hunts you by your kindness makes kindness expensive. I'd shaved the dusk margin to nothing, raised 3 flanks in the time I'd have given 2, hands flying ahead of my eyes, because out in the wet streets, the vessel was kneeling on a floor I'd just left, reading the heat that hadn't fled it yet, walking toward wherever the dry air called me next. So I rushed a wall I should have read with my whole body. The face was sagging brick over a recessed doorway where 9 of us slept. Dole with his bad ear to the stone, the lookout girl folded in the corner, one eye shut. The lean ran heavy to the left. It wanted line laid thick and 2 anchors to share the carry, never one to beg. I gave it 1 good anchor and 1 rushed thread, the dose thumb to a whisper exactly where the load leaned hardest. The seam lit blue-white, the way they all do. Then it grayed early. I was a lane over, refreshing a dead course, when I heard it. Not a crack, not yet, but a thing under the sound, a settling. Brick, learning its bridge, had thinned out from under it a full hour ahead of its 6. The blue had gone to bone. The bone had gone to ash. I ran. I came around the pier as the lintel breathed out for good and the flank walked. No clean drop, never clean. A slow, heavy lean, and then the whole face letting go at once. A 1/4 ton of wet brick folding into the doorway with a noise like a throat clearing dirt. Dust first, then the screaming. Dole had heard it the same second I had. He'd thrown 2 sleepers clear, shoved the girl out by her collar, bought the last half stride with his own body, and the corner of the face caught him across the shins as it came, pinned him to the cold step under a slab the size of a coffin lid. I dug. Bare hands, brick by brick, old mortar powdering into the splits of my knuckles, my breath sawing, the crew's hands in beside mine, all of us lifting the slab on a count and easing it off. His leg came free wrong. Below the knee it bent where no joint sits, the shin gone to gravel inside its own skin, a dark stain spreading slow through the dust on the step. He didn't scream again. Worse, he apologized, said he'd been slow, coughed brick out of his lungs, and tried to make a joke of his boot, which sat at an angle a boot has no business holding. I put my palm to the broken course. Habit, the reflex of a man who can stop 3 tons of fingers short of a stranger's chest. Cold brick met my hand, and the cold told me the thing this body had been telling me since the gutter, the thing I'd refused to hold still long enough to hear. I carry weight, never the wall. I can pin a flank off 40 sleeping heads for 6 hours and hand it back to the rain without a scar. I cannot set 1 bone. The glyph holds. It is never once healed, and when the hand that lays it shakes, it lets go early, and what it was holding comes down on whoever stood closest to believing in me. The girl pressed her sleeve to his leg to slow the dark. Anver stood with his empty can, the drum forgotten in his fist, watching me do nothing. Every roof I'd raised, every clean recall, every morning I'd handed a crack back to the weather untouched, all of it balanced on a thread no thicker than my own steadiness. Tonight, the thread was Dole's shin, in pieces, on a wet step in the dark. "He doesn't have to come for the camp," the girl said, her dead eye crusted shut, the live one fixed on the gray course above Dole. "He has to come for where it lands." The dark under Dole's boot kept spreading. I said nothing. She'd put the thing in the air, though, and the close walls held it the way wet lime holds a smell. I had built this whole stolen life on the wall letting go clean, blue to gray to the idea of itself, brick handed back to the rain, no scar in the shaft, no proof we'd ever stood there. The recall was my coat. It was also a clock any man in Wellgrad could read, once he learned its face. 6 hours, then the floor below is a doorway again. Then the doorway is a place a thing comes down. The vessel had learned the face. He didn't read Scorch like the brass who'd knelt at my cooling lines and found nothing and gone north cursing the rust on their instruments. He read cold. The heat a sleeping body leaves in a swept floor, the warmth banked in mortar, the ghost of dry air standing over folded heads. Once he understood the recall, that I never broke a wall, that the wall kept its own appointment to the minute, he stopped chasing the man. A man is fast. A man turns down lanes he's never walked and finds a can already drumming. A falling wall just waits on the calendar. You don't break what already falls. You stand where it will be. You wait. Anver said it first, hoarse, his empty can still forgotten in his fist. The gasworks shanty, 6 hours spent 4 nights back, recalled clean, given to the weather, had guildmen in its mouth now. Not searching, sitting, boots crossed at a low brazier, a herring gull picking the ash beside them, The whole lot of them parked on the route I always took back to refresh the kind work I couldn't bring myself to leave gray. The clean work. The trap I'd climbed into grinning, and here was the floor of it. Every roof I'd raised was an hour written down in advance. 11 of them. 11 addresses where, on a schedule a child could keep, a quarter ton would come walking down out of the dark, and under each one, a patient man with a folding chair and a flat palm could simply be early. Then the colder arithmetic landed, and it landed in my hands, the chart pin, left warm by my head, iron, an arm's reach from where I slept. He hadn't left it to tell me I found you. He'd left it to make me run. A hunted hand flies ahead of its eyes. A rushed can goes cold and gets shaken 3 strokes where it begs 6. A flank leaning heavy gets 1 anchor where it screams for 2. He never needed to catch me laying a glyph. He needed me frightened enough to lay a bad one. And then he only had to know which doorway I'd starve of line and stand a lane off in the wet, listening for the seam to go from bone to ash, an hour ahead of its life. He hadn't broken Dole's shin. I had. He'd built the weather that made my hand shake and let the wall keep its appointment. And somewhere out past the piers, he was already reading the heat of where I'd carry my guilt to next. The hunt wasn't a chase anymore. It was a man doing sums on my mercy and winning because every good thing I made was temporary, and temporary is just another word for known. I turned to look at the course I'd refreshed 2 lanes back, the one I'd laid wet and blue not 20 minutes gone, the dead one I'd brought back to life out of habit, out of the old reflex to leave nothing failing behind me. It had grayed at one corner already, and in the light pooling on the wet stone beneath it, where no shadow had stood when I laid the line, a shape was kneeling, coat dark, head bowed, one bare hand pressed flat to the floor, reading the warmth our running feet had left, smiling at the temperature of where we'd go. What held a thing forever, and what did the holding cost the thing held? I didn't go to the camp. I went to the wall, the guild's wall, the one I'd raised the wallace above and taken down clean, and I laid my palm flat on the granite where their marks lived, the deep-cut ones, fed and gilded, the glyphs that never grayed because no one ever let them. Cold, older cold than stone has any right to. My lines breathe, blue, gray, gone, brick handed back to the rain in 6 hours like a held breath let out. Theirs didn't breathe. Theirs had been bitten into the block a century deep, lead poured in the grooves, a brass cartouche pinned over each so the pigment beneath could never be reached, never shaken loose, never permitted to recall. I'd always read those marks as strength, the thing every climber wants. A hold that won't quit under you. I read them again with the vessels cold still in my fingers, and I read them wrong, the way I'd read everything wrong. A glyph that never lets go, never lets the wall move. The lintel can't sag and be answered. It must stand exactly as poured, or break a guild seal, and a broken seal is a fine, and a fine is a man's year. The masons came round each quarter with their little iron styluses and their ledgers, touching every cartouche, charging rent on permanence. You paid them to keep your house from becoming anything else. You paid them to forbid your own door from widening when your daughter grew, your shop from deepening when your trade did. That was the wall, not a thing that held, a thing that fixed. I walked the lower lanes in the wet with this turning in my hands like a bad anchor, and everywhere I looked now, the city was pinned. Brass on the granary, brass on the lockhouse, brass over the school door, green with verdigris, the date beneath it older than anyone breathing, the schoolroom inside the exact size it had been when herring still ran thick in the estuary and didn't anymore. Nothing could grow, nothing could fail and be mended into something better. Forever had been sold to them as safety and bolted on as a yoke. And the Wallace, Dole, the girl, the 24 on the clock, they were outlaws for one crime only. They carried no mark, no permanent seal stamped on a body, no cartouche over a man, nothing fixed. They lived in the 6 hours. They lived in the part of the city that was still allowed to change because no one had bothered to chain a doorway no one valued. I'd thought my whole stolen life was the weak hand, the temporary thing, the work a real mason would sneer at because it didn't last. I had it backwards. The blue going gray wasn't the flaw in my gift, it was the gift. A wall that recalls is a wall that can be rethought, relaid, raised somewhere it's needed, and given back when it isn't. A city that moves instead of one embalmed under brass and rent. The vessel hunted me through impermanence, because impermanence was the only freedom left running loose in Wellgrad. The guild had caged eternity around every block and called the cage protection. Forever was the prison. I'd been carrying the key on the end of a shaken can and apologizing for it. Something in me that had spent 4 months crouched, counting seconds, keeping my face slack and my hands empty so the brass would find nothing. Something in me stood up straight on the wet stone and did not crouch back down. Dole's shin was in pieces because I'd been running. Running is for men who only want to live. I was done wanting only that. I looked up the wall, the whole pinned face of it, every brass mark a hold I now knew how to make let go. They'd taught the city that lasting was the only safety. I'd teach it the other thing. Not break what falls, unfix what they'd frozen, lane by lane, until a door could widen and a wall could move and a man could change the shape of where he lived. I wasn't going to outrun the vessel. I was going to change the ground he stood on. I drew it on the slate that night, and the lines refused to lie down. Not from any shake in my hand, but because the shape I was after would not stand still long enough to be drawn. A building no ledger could hold. A stair that ate itself. For 4 months I'd built like a man saying sorry. Every shelter, every flank, every roof handed back to the rain. I'd read the gray creeping in as the bill coming due. The 6 hours a sentence I served and the wallless served beside me. I'd been laying things down and bracing for the loss. Wrong posture. You don't brace for the thing you mean to use. The turn came the way a rout comes when you quit fighting the rock and start asking it where it wants your weight. I didn't need a glyph to hold for 6 hours. I needed it to hold for 9 seconds. Long enough to stand on, long enough to reach past it and set the next. So lay the next. Step up. Let the one below go gray and go to rain while your boot is already 3 rungs gone. A ladder that deletes its own bottom rung. A stair with no landing because a landing is a place and a place can be charted, weighted beneath, pinned. Make nothing that lands. Make only the going up. The hunter read cold where a glyph had cooled and stood. A rung I left grayed behind me cooled to nothing in an air I'd already quit, and he could kneel under every dead corse in the city and find the negative of a man no longer anywhere near it. A schedule you can walk toward in the dark, not a sprint, never a sprint. I sat with the cold can between my knees and ran the numbers in my teeth. Thin line, small bite, low load, a bracket, not a beam. Just enough pigment to bear one starved body and no more, because mass I didn't lift was time I didn't spend. Diameter to dosage to load, the old grammar, run fast and run light. Gray time against climb time. If the line lived 9 seconds and I cleared it in 4, I banked 5. Bank 5 100 times up a 100-foot face and you have climbed a wall that was never there. The face I wanted was the worst one, the inner granite of the guild's own wall, the pinned side, brass cartouches marching up it course by course, like rivets up a hull, each one a forbidden hold, each one verdigris fat with a century of rent, smooth as a poured thing, no ledge a herring gull could stand on. The masons had bitten it clean. Precisely so nothing could climb, nothing could change, nothing could reach the top but their ledgers. And above the last course, past the lead and the cold, hung the only thing in Wellgrad they'd never managed to fix in place. Open sky, gray and moving, the one ceiling with no brass on it. I'd set the wallless above their wall once, on a tower I took down clean and apologized for. No apology this time. I'd run a body up the wall's own throat on rungs that died the instant they'd served. A structure that existed only while someone was inside it climbing, gone the breath after the boot cleared. Architecture you could only ever see from the back of a man already leaving. My fingers were still cold from the granite. Dole's shin floated up in me, the wet fold of it, the thing I'd never set right. This work would cost worse. One slow climber, one can shaken a half-beat late, one rung graying under a foot that hadn't lifted, and there'd be no slab to throw anyone clear of, only the drop and the 8 seconds I knew the exact length of. I needed the girl. Her eye, her count, her carrier's legs to seed cans up the route ahead of me, one-eyed and quick, where I'd be blind and slow. One thing I had to know before I bet a body on it, whether a rung would bear a second climber crossing, while the first still stood the first. I had until dusk to find out. The answer came on the third bracket, and it lied to me first. I'd set a rung 2 feet off the cinder floor of the coal store, low enough that a failure meant a bruised tailbone, not a box. Thin line, small bite. I stood on it and felt it take me. That small living tension under the boot a glyph gives before it gives out, and I called the girl across. She came light, one-eyed, quick, a sack of cold cans slung at her hip, her bad side turned to the wall the way she always turned it. The moment her weight crossed onto the bracket beside mine, the line grayed. Not at 9 seconds, but at 5. The gray running up the pigment like frost up a window. The load doubled, and the clock halved. We stepped off together onto the cinders. The rung let go behind us with a sound like a knuckle cracking. So, not a shared stand, a handoff. I ran it again and again until my teeth had the number. One body to a rung, always. The second climber crossing only in the breath the first was already leaving. Weight passed hold to hold, like a bucket up a fire line. Never two souls trusting the same dead pigment at once. The girl learned it in 4 tries. Her count was better than mine. Flat, merciless, a metronome with one eye. We told the crew that night under the viaduct, the wet coming through the arch in a slow sweat, the smell of pigment and rust thick as soup. Dole lay on the pallet with his shin trussed in a splint I'd lashed from a window bar, the wrong folded leg I'd never set right. He listened. He didn't look at the leg, and he didn't look away from me. When I finished, he said one word, "Go." And the rest of them, 24 Wallace who'd lived 4 months on my 6 hours, didn't argue the cost. They knew the cost. A man with a shattered shin had just named it for them, and named it cheap. They staked it all. Every can they'd bartered for, every hour of held weight left in their starved arms, onto a face no herring gull could stand on, a run with no landing, a stare that ate itself. Then I went up the practice wall, and the dead man woke. Kel's body knew nothing. The hands that gripped were a stranger's, soft in the wrong places, and the soles of these feet had never read a flank in their lives. Mine had. 32 years up steel and poured concrete, and the count I'd hated my whole life. 8 seconds, the exact length of a man falling off Corabell Tower with a parted braid, came back not as a sentence now, but as a tool. I knew gray time the way I'd known rope stretch. I knew a load before I lifted it. I knew, with my palm still flat on a cooling rung, the half beat before it would quit, the way you know a hold is rotten through your wrist before your eye admits it. Set, wait, trust, release. 4 counts and the rung dies under an air I've already left. I climbed the coal store wall to its lip on brackets that lived 9 seconds and bore one body and vanished, and the girl seated the cans ahead of me, blindside to the brick, calling the gray a half beat before I felt it. We moved like one animal with 2 spines. The thing that killed me was keeping us alive. Every instinct the fall had hammered into me, the count, the rope sense, the eye that reads a wall's bad face, all of it bent now toward the going up, toward a structure that stood only while a body was inside it climbing. At the lip, I stopped. Below, the dead rungs had cooled to nothing, no negative left for any hunter to kneel under and chart. Above, gray sky, moving, the one ceiling they'd never pinned. My borrowed hands shook on the cold stone. They didn't know why. I did. The plumb bob came down past my cheek on the 9th bracket, brass and true, paying out on a waxed cord from somewhere up in the gray. And a mason only hangs a plumb where he means to read a line, never where a man means to climb. Above us. All of it, above us. He read cold, not scorch. He'd gone up the walls clean inside on guild ladders bolted 40 years into the stone, set himself on the parapet, and let the heat of our climbing rise to him the way warmth climbs a flue. Our held breath, our gripping hands, the live pigment bleeding its small warmth up the face into his waiting palm, patient. Above the weather, where the wind off the estuary came clean and a herring gull rode it without once beating a wing. The girl reached the niche where the next can should ride, blindside to the brick, and her hand came back wrong. She held it up between two fingers. Light. A tin that rattled its ball bearing around too much air. The charge bled out of it into the dark by someone who'd known the exact crack we'd cached it in. Empty. Seated, empty. Anver had walled the night crew's caches. Anver, who'd carried for us a month and argued down every barter that the 6 hours was a sickness, that a man wanted 4 walls and a door that latched and not a roof, forever forgetting it was a roof. He'd carried the map of our hidden cans behind his teeth and sold it to the brass for a key. I found his mark when I knew to look. A mason's chalk plum, struck small at the lip of every gutted niche, neat as a signature, pointing the hunter up our spine. A wall of his own. That was the price. The voice came down the cord with the bob, flat as a spirit level. He gave you cheap, the vessel said, not loud, the words dropping bracket to bracket like water finding the low course. A doorway and a winter of bread. I'd have paid more for the man who measures his mercy out in 6s. My borrowed hands didn't shake now. They'd stopped knowing enough to be afraid. Below, at the wall's foot, the brass were already standing in the cooling print of where we'd started, patient as Anver's chalk, waiting on the recall to drop the lower brackets into their open hands. Above, the cord and the man who read warmth. Behind me, the climbed rungs had gone to nothing, cold pigment that had forgotten my weight the moment it left. No ladder to take back down, no door at my back, no 6 hours of anything between me and the drop I knew the exact length of. Up was the only word left. The wall's outer face was poured concrete gone green with 40 winters of estuary damp, slick where the rain tracked, bone dry in the lee of every sill, and I read it in the soles of a stranger's feet the way I'd read 1,000 flanks. The good holds, the rotten ones, the long blank run above the 7th course where a man had to trust dead pigment and nothing under it. I set a bracket. It took me 9 seconds, then that small living shiver that means leaving. The girl's bracket grayed under her at 5, not 9. Her weight and her held breath doubling the load the way 2 souls always doubled a dead hold. And she did the one clean thing there was to do. Came across onto mine in the half beat I was already quitting it. Hold to hold, bucket up the fire line, the 2 of us hung one body to a rung with no seated can ahead and a hunter paying brass down at our faces. Hands flying ahead of my eye. Mercy gone expensive, charged by the inch. I went up the cord with my eyes to find the fist that held it. Found it. A gloved hand on the parapet's lip, white-knuckled on the wax. And beside it, bare and flat and unhurried, the vessel's own palm came down to lie against the cold rung just above mine, to read, straight through the dead pigment, exactly what my next breath of weight would tell it to do. Salt first. It came off the estuary in a single clean slap. No rust in it, no pigment, no wet stone reek of the undercroft. Just cold water and distance. The taste a man forgets a city has been keeping from him 40 winters deep. My borrowed mouth opened for it. The last course of the wall ran a hand's width above my knuckles, capped in green-furred concrete worn round, and beyond it, nothing. No more holds to read. I set the final bracket blind, by feel, the way you set the one you won't get to test. It took 9 seconds, and in the 9th I was already over the lip, dragging the girl's wrist up behind me, the 2 of us spilling onto a parapet wide as a coffin lid and twice as cold. The whole gray weight of Wellgrad dropping away under our boots in a single dizzy fold of roofline and lightwell and chimney pot. Every tower I'd raised and stripped laid out small and dark beneath the moving sky. Up. There was no more up. I died for this. Corbell's braid parting in my fist, the count starting on its own. 1, 2. The river coming. 8 seconds is what a body has. The length of a man dropped before the ground collects the debt. And I'd spent mine falling in another life, and never once got to spend them rising. Now, the wind paid them back. It crossed the parapet clean off the water and went straight through Kel's starved ribs as if the bone were a gate left open, lifting the rag of my collar, drying the climb sweat cold against my neck, smelling of nothing the guild owned. A herring gull tipped past at eye height, close enough to show the red dot on its yellow bill, riding the updraft off the face without one beat of its wings, held, the way I was held, on a pressure that didn't care who measured it. I counted. Old habit. The only arithmetic I trusted. 1, 2. The sky did not forget my weight. 3, 4. The estuary turning pewter to the seaward edge where the light got out from under the cloud. 5, 6. And 6 was the number that meant something down in the dark. The held alibi, the schedule a man could be walked toward. But up here, 6 was just a breath. And there was a 7th waiting after it that no one had ever charted because no one up here was hunting. 7. I tasted the 8th the way you taste rain before it falls. The girl was laughing. Not a sound, just her ribs going under my arm, her one eye streaming, her chalk gray face turned up into the open with her cracked lips apart like a child catching the first of a downpour. Below us, the brass stood in their cooling print at the wall's foot, faces white as thumbprints, waiting on a recall that had nothing left above it to drop. The lower brackets would gray, the fire line would forget us. Let them wait under the spot where we'd been. We weren't there anymore. We were here, where no plumb line had ever swung, because no mason had ever thought a wall-less man would climb the one wall that mattered to stand a breath above the guild and breathe what the guild breathed for free. 8 seconds of sky returned to me with interest in a stranger's lungs. Then the cord went slack. Not paid out, cut at the top, or let go, the waxed line dropping past my shoulder in a slow, brass-weighted curl, the plumb bob that had hunted us up the spine swinging dead now, purposeless, because the man who read warmth no longer needed to read it from below. I turned with the wind still in my teeth. The vessel came over the lip one ledge behind, unhurried, both bare palms laid flat to the cold capstone to take its measure. And he did not look at me at all. He looked at the parapet under my boots, at the live heat my standing body was bleeding down into the green concrete this very breath, and I understood, too late, with the open sky still sweet on my tongue, that I had carried my own warmth to the one place on this earth with nothing left above it to climb, and set it, hand-warm, into his waiting palm. You set it to recall, he said, which means you've already told me the hour you come down. The wind tore half the words off his mouth, but I read the rest the way he'd read everything else of mine, by the shape, by the cold. His palms stayed flat to the capstone, fingers spread. He was tasting the warmth my borrowed body had bled into the brackets that carried us up, the whisper-dosed threads strung down the face, each one holding its 6, and not a breath passed. The count sat in my own soles like a pebble in a boot. The wall was lending me its summit the way a man lends you the chair he means to take back before you finished sitting. 6 hours, I said. Same as anything I make. Same as everything you've ever made. He raised his head, and his eyes were a cold reader's eyes, pale and patient, run dry at the rims from staring at heat nobody else could see. That's the whole of it. You don't build, you borrow. You hang a roof over 40 sleeping heads, and at dawn you hand it back to the rain, and you name the handing back mercy. No scar, I said, no debt. They wake owing nobody. They wake under the open sky you promised them shelter from. A herring gull screamed off the face below, and he never blinked. My glyphs hold, bonded, licensed, carved into the stone until the stone forgets it was ever 2 pieces. A child born under one of mine dies under it, and so does hers. That is a roof. What you do is a held breath, and a held breath is only the long way round to drowning. Under my left boot, the concrete went a half degree colder. I felt it through the soul, the way you feel a hold begin to weep. Early. The thread I'd set blind. 3 strokes maybe where it wanted 6. My hand not as still as I'd sworn it those last 40 feet. You don't have to fight me, I said, understanding it as I said it. No, almost gentle. I never did. You taught me that, Mason. Temporary is only another word for known. I don't hunt the camp. I stand where the recall lands, and I wait. He lifted one bare palm off the green cap and laid it flat on the parapet's inner edge, the guild's own ashlar, the course that had stood 400 winters and would stand 400 more. I climbed up here to be standing on the part that stays, so I could watch the part that doesn't. The girl's hand tightened on my coat, her ribs stilled against my arm, the silent laughing gone out of her in one breath, her one eye tracking the same cold travel up the cap that I'd already felt under my foot. His whole logic, plain as a plumb line. He needn't throw a single punch. He only had to outlast the thing I'd built to vanish. Let me carry my own warmth up the one course no Wallace man would dare. Let me set my own hour into the stone with these shaking hands, and then plant his weight on the part that never moves, and count me down. The free air cost them nothing, I said, salt still sweet on my tongue, and lying to myself with it. You charge the same people rent on the dark and call it permanence. I charge them certainty. He watched my boots, not my face. A man can't be driven off a wall that won't move. You can't be anywhere by morning. That's your gift and your grave. You exist for 6 hours, and then you're a rumor and a cold print on a flagstone. I exist always. Which of us does the sleeping child believe in, Mason, when the brick starts to fold? Dole's stripped hand. I heard it under the words, the quarter-ton folding into the doorway. The bone, I could pin a flank off 40 heads, but could never once set. The glyph holds. It has never healed. She believes in whoever's still under it at dawn, I said. Then you've already lost her. His smile cracked through the dry plaster of his face. Because you won't be. The cold reached the middle of the capstone. I heard it before I felt it, a sound like green ice giving on a winter barrel. A long, grain-deep tick running the parapet's length out of the bracket I'd set blind. The thread let go a full hour ahead of its 6. The summit dropped out from under my heel. My hand had the can out before my eyes caught up. Thumb to the nozzle, the old reflex screaming, "Feed it, 3 strokes, leave nothing failing." The capstone tipped under me like a loaded hod sliding off a wet plank. Cold ran the parapet's whole length, my blind-set bracket weeping it, the bond coming apart grain by grain. I took my thumb off the nozzle. Because that was the hold he'd cut the root to, not the bracket, the reflex. He'd hunted me 11 nights to teach my own hand this exact panic, the frightened patch, the bad glyph laid to save a thing already gone. And then he meant to stand a lane off in the wet and listen for it to fail in a place he'd already marked. His whole trap balanced on me fighting to keep the wall up, on the wall holding. So I let it fall. I shook the can once, that dry rattle my life had narrowed down to, and instead of feeding the gray, I struck the recall across every thread I'd strung down the face. All of them. The whisper-dosed lines that had carried us up, spent in one stroke, clean. Not held, released. The lattice began to come undone from the top in the order I'd built it, 6 hours each, and not a breath passed, peeling off the black stone the way frost goes off brick under the first finger of sun. I caught the girl by the collar, swung her hard toward the inner edge, the guild's ashlar, the 400 winter course the vessel stood on. Her boots scraped stone. Her one eye went white wide, and her fists knotted in Kel's sleeve, the whole light weight of her trying to haul me back onto the part that wouldn't move. I peeled her fingers off one at a time, set her palm flat to the cold, permanent rock. Stay where it stays, I said. Count the inside stair. Then I went the other way, off the lip, onto the failing thing, into the 8 seconds I'd already died once and had handed back to me as rising. Except now, I rode them downward, hand over fist on threads that were ash a yard above my grip and still iron a yard below, the recall chasing me like a tide sucking back off a flooded stair. Each hold good for exactly as long as I needed it, gone the instant I didn't. Wellgrad came up to meet me in slabs of sodium glare and tar smell and the wet breath of 1,000 sleeping chimneys. A herring gull peeling off the face to my left, screaming, certain I was carry-on already. I heard him understand. No words. A sound. The scrape of a gilled boot abandoning 400 winters of certainty. He'd read it the way he read everything cold. The only road off a wall no man could climb down was the one I was dissolving as I dropped. His permanence had turned into a perch with no stair beneath it. The man who'd told me a held breath was just the long way round to drowning stepped off his stone, at the very last, to trust mine. One stride late. The thread he reached for had already kept it 6 and turned to nothing in the cold air. Exactly as I'd made it, exactly on time. No scar, no debt, no hand left to owe. His fist closed on a yard of dissolving pigment and the lights of the city behind it. I felt the lattice lurch as his weight asked it for something that wasn't there anymore, and I understood, falling, that I could have slowed it. One stroke. I could have kept that single line iron under his hand for the time it takes a frightened man to find a foothold. The can was in my grip. My thumb knew the move. I let it dissolve. He didn't go the way Dole's wall went. No thunder, no quarter-ton folding a doorway shut. He dropped quiet through the haze, a small, dark plumb line passing the windows he'd carved roofs over for a lifetime. And the last of him I'll ever have was his open palm, still spread, still reading the air for the warmth of a thing that had already kept its promise and gone. I hit the undercroft slag with both heels, and Kel's knees folded me into the rust and the puddled dark. The girl came down the inside stair a long time after, screaming something the wind had already eaten, and dropped beside me with her one eye fixed up the face where the threads were still letting go, link by link, returning the summit to the rain on the schedule I'd set it. Above us, the wall stood as it had for 400 winters, clean, unmarked, owing nobody. I'd kept the whole of my life's promise on it. I'd left nothing failing. Only a man who finally believed me, 1 second after it came true. Gray light came up through the slag vents and bars, laying itself across my chest in stripes I could count, and a single gull feather turned in the runoff at my ear, going nowhere, riding the same inch of black water around and around the drain. My ribs took the breath in like a door swollen in its frame. Above us, the last threads were still letting go. I watched one peel and vanish against the paling sky, and the sky did not crack, and the wall did not fall. The city had its windows open. They'd thrown the shutters back the way you do for a fire, every tenement face along Kettle Row crowded with pale ovals, mouths working, hands gripping sills they'd been told for 400 winters were the only honest stone in Wellgrad. They had watched a man go up what could not be climbed. They had watched the road behind him eat itself. And now they watched nothing come down where I dissolved it. No debris, no scar, no quarter-ton folding a doorway into a grave, only rain returning to rain on a schedule someone had chosen. That was the thing they couldn't unsee. A guild warden stood at the foot of the inner stair in his oiled gray, the lantern staff in his fist throwing a hard white circle on the ashlar, and he kept lifting it toward the summit as if the light could prove the threads back into being. His mouth made the old word, permanence. It came out of him thin. A boy near me, no more than 9, soot in the creases of his neck, looked from the warden's shaking staff up to the clean black stone, and I watched the arithmetic happen behind his one good front tooth. The sworn thing was afraid, and the vanishing thing had kept its word to the second. The boy laughed, once, sharp. It went down the row like a dropped tile down a roof, picking up others, and somewhere a woman started to clap in a flat, slow rhythm that wasn't joy, that was harder than joy, the sound of a debt being recalculated in front of the man who'd come to collect it. A bargeman leaned out and spat past the warden's boot into the gutter. An old dyer with cracked, matter-stained knuckles reached up and laid her palm flat against the last visible thread an instant before it went, and felt it go, and held her empty hand in front of her face like she'd caught something she'd been promised her whole life she couldn't. The warden's circle of light wavered off the stone. He understood it the way the other one had understood it, falling, too late, all at once, with the body before the mind. His authority had been a held breath, the long way round to drowning, and the city had just watched a stranger let his own breath out clean and live. He lowered the staff. He did not give an order. The gray men around the plinth shifted their weight foot to foot the way men do on a ledge that has begun, very quietly, to tilt. Nobody moved to take me. The girl was breathing against my shoulder in hard, short pulls, her one eye still fixed up the face, her fist still knotted in Kel's wet sleeve where I'd set it. I worked my own fingers open against the slag. They opened. The can rolled out of them and rang once on the iron and lay there spent, dry rattling nothing, light as a finished thing. I'd thought for 11 nights that I ran to keep the pigment alive, that the magic was a flame I carried and the running was only the wind I made to keep it lit. That was a lie I'd been told by the men who wanted me tired. I sat up in the rust. My heels were ruined and my left wrist had a grind in it that would never quite leave, and the dyer's empty, astonished hand was somewhere above me catching rain, and for the first time the wall in front of me was just a wall. A surface, holds, weights, failure points, and not a sentence I was serving. The threads were gone. The reason to run had gone up with them, and I found the want still there in my chest, separate now, a hold under my own hand that nobody had carved and nobody could recall. Good for exactly as long as I kept reaching for it. I got my feet under me. The girl looked up at me with that white, wide eye, asking the only question left, and I jerked my chin at the mouth of the undercroft where the gray men weren't standing, where the city was making its slow, loud subtraction at the warden's back. Not held, released. I picked the empty can up off the iron and put it in my coat, because it was mine and because I was going to need it, and stepped out into a Wellgrad that had just learned the difference. This time, no one was hunting me out the door. Water found the low point of the undercroft and pooled, and in the pool, Kel's open hand lay palm up, the way a hand falls when nothing in the man holds it shut anymore. Palm up. The girl had not let go of his sleeve, her fist knotted in the wet wool, knuckles white as boiled bone, and she watched the doorway, not him, because someone had taught her the dead keep and the living don't. I crouched. My ruined heels argued. Kel had no wound you could point to. The night had simply asked more of him than a beggar's chest could pay, and somewhere on the climb up Kettle Row, to watch a stranger unmake the wall, he had set the girl's hand in mine, then folded down against the slag, and went out like a wick. Like that. I'd felt him cool under the cheering, and put her fist back in his sleeve so she'd have a thing to hold that wasn't me. Now the cheering was thinning into argument up the stair, the water kept climbing, and I had to decide what a man like me does with a man like him. Two names sat in the cold with us. One was Kel's, a beggar's name, worn to a single hard syllable, the kind you give a dog or a debt. He'd told it to me on my second night, before he knew what I was, when a name still cost him nothing to share. The other was stitched inside this stolen coat, the one the climber's mother had screamed off a scaffold years before I woke wrong inside his hands. Terrace. I asked for neither. I'd worn the climber's calluses and cracked nails and the grind in his wrist. I'd eaten Kel's bread and kept Kel's silence, and now both men were dead, and only I stood in their leavings, deciding which to spend. Above us, a new arithmetic. I could hear it through the slag vents. Not riot. Riots are stupid and brief. But the slow, ugly sound of people doing a forbidden thing in the open and finding the sky did not fall. A chalk line scraped on wet stone somewhere off Kettle Row, then another. By the third, I had it. The dyer with the madder knuckles was showing a boy how to set a mark that would hold a doorway 6 hours and then let go clean. And the boy was showing his sister, and it moved like damp up a wall, room to room, in the dark, while the guild slept on the lie that it owned the only honest stone in Wellgrad. Damp winds given time, not freed, loosened. The gray men still walked the plinth. The wall still stood black and clean where I'd taken the threads, and a warden's word still moved most doors in this city. What had broken was smaller than freedom and harder to mend. The town had watched the craft done once, cleanly, on a schedule a man chose, and you cannot make 1,000 people forget a hold once their own hands have found it. The monopoly had a crack in it now. Cracks take weight. Somewhere above, the warden had not moved. I pictured him on the plinth, lantern staff gone heavy in his fist, learning the weight of a word that no longer carried. Let him learn it. I felt no pity, only the flat interest you feel watching a cornice you've already cleared come down behind you. I worked the girl's fingers off the sleeve one at a time, the way you pry a pumped climber off a hold before she peels. She let me. I folded Kel's open hand shut over nothing and pressed it into the cold. And then I did the thing the guild had spent 400 winters forbidding. I built him a marker that would not last. A line of pigment along the slag, across his chest. 6 hours, then gone. I said his name out loud once, into the drip and the rising water, and let the sound do what the threads had done, hold its shape for as long as it was true, then stop. That was the only honest monument I had. Not stone, not permanence. A name said clean and released on a schedule, so no one could come later and carve it into a lie. Then I took the other one. I gave it to the girl like a hand offered down a pitch. Terrace. Hers came up, a single I, and after a while, a name of her own, small, that I won't set down here yet, because it was the first thing she'd chosen to give since the night that took the I. She chose. So did I. I'd carry Kel's craft and his bread in me and answer to the climber's name, because the body was the tool I had, and a tool wants the right name to be called by. The beggar I'd spend slow, the climber I'd wear. The girl tugged me toward the vent where the chalk lines were multiplying. Up there, someone with no idea what they were doing had set a glyph too greedy for the wall it sat on, and I felt it through the floor the way you feel a flake about to peel. Wrong weight, wrong schedule, a doorway promising to carry a tenement's full load and meaning to let go at the worst possible second. Wrong, all of it. The craft was loose in a city that had never been taught to read failure points, and they were going to start dropping things on their own heads. I was the only one in Wellgrad who knew, to the second, when. Frost on the rung took my thumbprint and kept it. I went up. The stairwell stank of cat and lamp oil, and the sweet green rot of mortar giving up its grip. And on every landing, a chalk line glowed faint as a fishbone, each one set by a hand that had watched me on the wall and gone home with half a lesson. Half is worse than none. 3 flights up, I felt it through my soles. The same wrong hum a flake makes before it peels. The doorway off the turn, fattened with pigment, loaded to carry a tenement's whole spine and timed by some hopeful idiot to let go at the hour the mill bell emptied the upper rooms. 40 families above it, sleeping. I crouched at the jam and read the work the way you read a stranger's anchor before you trust it with your weight. And it was greedy, all of it. A grasping bright mark that wanted to hold forever and so would hold nothing. Because the wall behind it was lime, and lime breathes, and breath and permanence have never once shared a bed. Lime always wins. The boy who'd said it had copied my hand and skipped my arithmetic. He'd taken the shape and missed the schedule. The schedule was the whole craft. I shook my can. It rattled thin. 1 bead left, the dry click of it against tin. But a single bead is enough to unwrite, and unwriting is the thing I am for. Here is the number I've carried in this wrist since the night I woke wrong inside it. 2 centimeters. That was the gap between the climber's last reach and the hold that would have kept him. 2 centimeters of wet air. A thumb laid flat, The distance no pigment in the world will close once a hand has committed past it. Then 8 seconds. 8 seconds of stone going by. Long enough to know, too short to do. The precise length of a life spent learning that nothing built to last will catch you when you fall. I used to take those numbers for a sentence passed down on me. They were a measurement. 2 centimeters, 8 seconds. The cost of trusting a hold to be permanent. I learned the other trick late, and in someone else's hands. I sprayed one line across the greedy mark, and the pigment I lay eats the pigment that grasps. The door sighed. The false load slid off the lie and back down into the honest beam where it had always belonged. And over the cleared jam, I set my own thing, dim and modest, good for 6 hours, and then nothing. Time enough for 40 sleepers to wake and walk down on their own feet. 6 hours, then gone clean. I notched the hour into my teeth out of old habit, and knew, this time, it would keep itself. The girl waited on the half landing, her one eye holding the chalk glow, and when the door settled, she laid her palm flat against it, the way you'd lay a hand on a spooked horse to feel it stop trembling. Not the shape. I taught her the count there in the dark. Shapes spread on their own, damp up a wall, but the schedule was the only part the guild had truly buried, because a thing that ends when you say it ends is a thing no man can own. When to let go. That was the whole of what I had to give. This is the work now, the only trade the new body fits. I keep one can on my hip and refill it from the dyer's vats with whatever's gone cheap that week. Madder, woad, the rust red that stains your palms for days. Before the guild stirs, I walk the low rooms and read the greedy marks the loosened city leaves itself. Unwrite the ones that mean to kill, and where a wall needs holding, I hold it the only honest length. A while, then not. No statue, no deed. A while. We climbed out onto the roof. Below us, the stairs were waking. Dawn came up over Wellgrad, the gray of a herring gull's back, and the city lay under it the way it always lay. Close walls, wet slate, rust running orange from the gutter mouths in long tongues, the river breathing its tin and pigment stink up between the tenements, smoke from the first kettles, a door slamming 3 roofs over, the ordinary machine of a town that did not yet know how loose it had come in the night. Across the lane, the dyer's tenement wore a face I'd set 2 nights back, a brace of pigment over a cracked spandrel, holding the stone steady while the masons slept off their wages. And as the sun cleared the mill stack, the mark reached its hour and let go. Not falling, thinning, the bright glyph going to haze and then to nothing, and the cracked stone behind it taking up its own weight again in the clean, low light, unmarked, unowned, standing because it could and not because a warden's word commanded it. The facade dissolved, the wall stood, both of them true, each in its turn. That was the whole of it, the thing 400 winters of permanence had been built to keep me from learning. A made thing is most honest in the moment before it goes. Stone Lies by Stang. I hooked my heels in a rust hole and sat on the parapet and watched the last of it burn off into the day. 2 centimeters. 8 seconds. The numbers didn't drop on me anymore. I spent them. On a beggar's name said once. On a door held just long enough, on a wall let go clean into the light. A herring gull dropped past the eave with a crust in its beak. The girl said her small chosen name into the cold, once, testing the weight of it, and let it go. Beside me, her shoulder was warm. I breathed in, wet stone, matter, smoke, sky.